As a reflection of our conversation today on the subject of congruency, I'd like to share an excerpt from Nemec's manifesto from the final episode of the TV show Andor. There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. Remember this: freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Random acts of insurrection are occurring constantly throughout the galaxy. There are whole armies, battalions, that have no idea they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward. And then remember this: the imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks, it leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear.
Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, before we dive into our conversation on congruency today, I wanted to share some really cool news. Our newsletter has now moved over to Substack. So, you can go visit martinperkins.substack.com and you can read all of our fresh stuff. We're also republishing things there. There are going to be things that you can get in your inbox every other week or as we see fit. And there are going to be some things like the Beatitudes that are just being published as a post over there. So do check us out. And if you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. martinperkins.substack.com.
Over the years of journaling and its shared creative work, which manifested as my book and the essays that I've published, a word keeps returning to my conscious awareness: congruency. I was recently listening to an audiobook titled "Why So Serious" by sports writer Mike Singer. I'm an NBA basketball fan, and it's a love I have that expresses itself both as a love of sports, but also a love of basketball, and really, in truth, a love for my son, something we share together. And congruent was used by a teammate of basketball player Nikola Jokic to describe him as a human being. And in the definition that this player used with Jokic, what you see is what you get. He's describing a sense of being genuine. And, this really worked for me. It also explained in the simplest of terms why I appreciate Jokic so much, and as well why I'm so disinterested, even repulsed by our world and its seemingly comfortable presentation of itself in this one way publicly and then this other way behind closed doors. That it's this creation of lives that are so incongruent. It's literally painful to be a part of a world that looks so blatantly this way.
I think you've touched upon something really important, and that's the thing where we need to really do a lot of work to realize that even though, we're addressing celebrities and social media influencers, right? Spiritual teachers, politicians, all of this applies to them. We watch them. We're participating in that. That is an everyday aspect of life in a world of media, right? Of multimedia. So this is something we really want to explore more of, that everyday quality. But in terms of a hierarchy, I do think that there's something to be said about the way that people of privilege, right? People in power set precedents, make examples. And what's important to note right now in this respect to celebrity or public figures is what's appearing more acutely right now with the Epstein files and how that's slowly and publicly, right, taking down folks that are seen as heroes to many of us. men quite often, and men like Deepak Chopra and Noam Chomsky, which for me is something that I'm actively grieving, right?
Me too. Me too. Much less so for me, Deepak Chopra. I, though, understand those people who are or have been followers of his and his brand of personality, right? These are all painful reminders of just how incongruent a person's persona can be with their choices outside the public discourse. And, until Me Too, there was a sort of wink, wink, nod, nod amongst men when it came to the abhorrent actions of many men in these powerful positions. The boys will be boys thing. And Me Too changed that to a degree, but it didn't change the incongruent issue. In the larger sense, there are many men who looked at it and, treated it as an opportunity to heal and grow, right? For ourselves and how we interacted in the world. And then there's men who treated it as a way, oh, we have to be more careful with our bigotry, with our misogyny. We've got to rein it in so we don't get caught being toxic. So what happened is, in large measure, the men not willing to grow were more than willing to not only be incongruent with themselves, but worse yet, amongst older men who are leaders on some level, they seize the opportunity to begin to teach younger men how to be toxic in this way.
To keep that legacy up. Yeah.
A lack of emotional intelligence amongst these men and an unwillingness to want to change their behaviors. You can be 12 forever. You can be 8, worse yet, forever, right? Not that there's anything wrong, but we both know that 8-year-old boys are, and 8 to 12-year-old boys, they're going through some stuff, right? And there's a distinction I would offer between what we're describing in terms of, not getting caught being toxic and any kind of conversation that occurs in social circles, at parties, anytime people gather, right? Anytime people gather, there's going to be playful banter, there's going to be teasing, there's going to be, I don't know, innuendo thrown around. There's going to be, for some of us, sardonic, and at other times, guttural humor, right? Potty humor, as it's sometimes called, right? Bathroom humor, right? And I've witnessed it many times when people feel safe enough to say things that they wouldn't otherwise say, but feel safe in that circle. And if we took what they said exclusively in these, just little quotes, and we lose the larger context, then something does get lost. And I don't want that to get lost. I want people to feel safe enough to let some of their shadows out. So the point of this isn't to be the emotional thought police in all this, right? This isn't what we're talking about in terms of being congruent. We're really talking about ways in which those moments that I'm describing, these social circles, can be used by the individual as a way to heal and grow. What did someone in the circle say, or what did I say in the circle that left me uncomfortable? Why was I uncomfortable about that? That's about me, right? That's about me. Even if it wasn't directed at me, it's recognizing my edges, or in some instances, not recognizing my edges, right? Maybe someone else points out to me, hey, didn't that make you uncomfortable? And I'm like, no, I didn't see it, right? So all these social opportunities we have as, in some ways, prompts to dig a little deeper, right? Life as showing up as a thought or soul journaling prompt. I think it's also worth noting that in those circles, as a form of self-reflection, because of my own dry and somewhat sardonic sense of humor, that, when does it bring harm into the conversation or to a particular individual? And, at that particular moment, I've learned to recognize that there's something unexamined that's leaking out of me.
This examination really resonates quite deeply with me. As someone who also has a somewhat sardonic sense of humor, but there's maybe a little bit more of a whimsical lilt that I add to that.
Yep, you do.
This really does ring true. And I want to take this opportunity as a healing and growth moment, right? To be vulnerable and authentic in this shared space is really important in terms of what we're talking about, because we got to walk our talk in this way. So when we're talking about those edges that we encounter and the degree of congruence or incongruence and self-reflection that occurs, I want to share very directly. I know that I used to lead with this notion that my sense of humor was a way to connect and share something of myself with new people. And I want to be very clear about that new people aspect of it, because you and I have shared so many of the same circles for decades now that there are those blinders that can be up. There are those biases that can be up. Sense of humor works in a particular place with a particular group of people, and it doesn't always occur, right? So I feel that this approach probably stemmed from doing improv comedy during my teenage years, trying out that edge in a public place to get a laugh.
Right.
But more recently, this has hit a more uncomfortable edge, as you noted. And where that acidity in my humor, even though there might be that smile or that whimsical lilt in my voice, like I noted, the humor is met with more disgust. And I didn't anticipate that. And, what I figured as being a playful and even largely benign wink at some social or family role or attitude has become considered appalling at times. So it's just so happened that then a shunning happens and I don't recognize it. To go back to what you noted about reflecting on something later or being told by someone else, hey, you noticed this occurred, right? Sometimes I haven't caught certain aspects of the shared moment. In this regard, it's left me feeling flummoxed and overwhelmed, because ultimately my intent wasn't to be mean, right? But to jab at the nature of society and in that way encourage an open circle where people could be themselves. Again, using humor as a way to share a part of my truth and encouraging others to then share a part of their truth.
To be accepted. Yeah.
And feeling like it's a common language when it's not always going to be a common language. And so through self-reflection and journaling, like you've noted, and meditation, and sometimes even just feeling really angry, frustrated, confused, feeling those feelings in a very immediate way, as long as it's in a safe space. And, I've come to realize that on an energetic level, there are simply going to be people and places that I don't always connect with. They don't always connect with me. And that's okay. I don't need to be liked or understood by everyone, right? And being uncomfortable or even inadvertently creating discomfort is a part of life. It's an opportunity to be responsible, and that means in a holistic sense. So from within, first with yourself and then with others. But that edge, that kind of edge can be really sharp and really overwhelming and really rich with fear. It can be hard to navigate, and you want to be strategic about these things. You want to be careful. You want to be mindful. And I really want to emphasize here the need to ground oneself in those moments of when it's really scary and when that edge is really sharp.
Right. And I think that in a different social situation, when we speak of acceptance, that to recognize that acceptance is about truly, to the degree to which we can within any social situation, be accepted to the depth and degree to which we can be real and authentic or genuine or whatever word we want to use, congruent with that situation to a degree to we can trust it. And so therefore, can we express a version of kindness rather than being nice? Right? One of the subjects that I cover in the authenticity chapter of my book is the notion of being nice versus kind, and that kindness contains truth in a way that niceness does not. And I would suggest that just as dangerous or toxic as alienating another is presenting ourselves as less than truthfully as a mode of being light, right? Of being nice, of being accepted, but not accepted for true who we are, but rather being accepted to the degree to which the rules of that social group deem we adhere to. We're adhering to a certain set of often inauthentic rules, right? Because within that social group, there's a kind of control and an inauthentic form of control asserted. And it naturally finds expression, therefore, in that group, whether we're talking about, a group of 3 or 4, a group of 100, a group of millions. We find ourselves dancing with this notion of to what degree are there rules of control asserted into the social group as a mode of reaching a certain goal, which we're going to discuss a little bit further down this path of conversation. But when that mode of control is asserted in this way, that people feel so comfortable in themselves or comfortable with the idea of wearing a mask, I should say, an internal mask, right? A social mask of being nice, a social mask of being accepted for what the social group deems as, whatever the flavor of the week of that social group's mode of being. We end up then with people wearing masks in the larger world, literal masks, and not masks to preserve one's health or well-being, as we saw during the pandemic, but masks worn with M16s and tactical gear in hand, meant to subjugate, meant to separate, meant to commit monstrous acts and not be held accountable because of their anonymity. Because that's one of the aspects of wearing a mask, is you remain anonymous. It kind of reminds me a bit of a moment I experienced when I was a teacher at the acupuncture program at MUI, before it now become defunct. I was an associate professor, and one trimester we used online evaluations for courses. Prior to that, it had always been these handwritten forms that were given out to the class. I'd step out, someone would be assigned to collect them all and take them directly to the dean. And up until it was shifted to online evaluations, there would be criticisms, but they would be constructive. The moment that it moved into online evaluations, the complete character of how those evaluations occurred changed. And it wasn't with just, like, for instance, with the classes I taught, it was across the board. It was almost as if the platform itself did not lend itself well to authentic communication, critical feedback. And instead, what you ended up with was that the leadership team decided to throw out all the evaluations for that trimester because they were so radically different than they had been prior. And they went back to handwritten evaluations. It was a very revealing moment in how social dynamics work once they enter the kind of social media environment, right? The online environment where a certain form of anonymity exists. It was a strange moment. And this was 15 years ago. And I would suggest that the toxicity of that environment has become even more dangerous in the ensuing 15 years.
Well, it's not just the anonymity that speaks to control and incongruence, right? It's also the ability to live within that social media space as a radically different person than the one that you are offline.
Well said. Well said. Right. As if there's a different persona there that people can wear.
That's something that's really incredible. And Naomi Klein has a book called Doppelganger, where she writes directly about this in a personal experience, where people confuse her with the other author, Naomi Wolf, online. Naomi Klein's getting attributions to things that she as a person, as a writer, as a intellectual didn't do. And I think this really speaks to the friction and then ultimately the dissonance that can occur. And I think within that dissonance, then there is a power vacuum, right? You speak to the power of the anonymity, covering your face, holding that M16 and walking around in tactical gear, and as it feels more and more normalized, this speaks to, what was shared in the quote from Andor. It speaks to the toxic masculinity. It's reflective of all these spaces where quite simply it gets down to the lack of emotional intelligence, like you noted earlier. Boys will be boys. You can be 12 years old forever. So this aspect of being incongruent equals control, being incongruent equals the highest form of power, and you're rewarded and protected for being incongruent. We see that every day in the way that society operates. It's strategic, it's disembodied, I would argue. It's the fact that everyone is so careful to present themselves with whatever mask is going to keep themselves in a place of being nice, even when they're a bully, being nice, even when they're manipulating, being nice in these ways that cause continual, deeply rooted harm to our humanity. This takes us out of ourselves. It's stupid. And I would frame stupid as when you willingly, deliberately give yourself away to some external sense of control. You're not present. You're not there. So what can we do to bring ourselves, societally out of that daydream?
Well, I think one way is that number one, we identify that authenticity, being genuine, we see as holding value. And we do so, at least in part, by shedding light on all the ways and costs that come with being inauthentic. In other words, what is the cost to the individual and to the society when incongruence rules the day? And whether we're talking about a social media influencer that has to give up their work because the incongruence between their social media life and their actual life comes to light in the ways that reveals just how toxic and painful it is to live that way. Because there's a whole generation of young people who look at social influencers and go, oh, an easy way to make huge amounts of money. But it comes at an enormous cost to put this face forward in the manner in which it's being presented as necessary in order to succeed in that way. And so we need to really be willing to pull back the curtain over and over, not once, not twice, over and over again. Pull back the curtain on what it really means. And I know in my own life, it's been a journey in being a book author, in learning to be a podcaster, and learning how can I present myself in ways that feel authentic and real and aligned. And it's just as importantly, more importantly, I would say, doing it in ways that feel like how I'm relating to that persona feels true to me. In other words, I'm not willing to be on social media all the time in order to succeed in that world. So I have to accept the fact that by not being willing to be on social media all the time, generating content or being this very extroverted figure that I'm not, there's a consequence to that. And it's one that I can accept. And, it kind of brings us to the conversation of this notion of agendas or strategic thinking as a necessity. So, for many people in the social media world, they're willing to dwell in this like social media, like lifestyle, if we want to call it that, because to them, the end justifies the means. Where I'm far more concerned with what's the journey I'm taking, because I'm far more interested in the journey itself than I am on where it takes me. And I think that's where the question of authenticity really comes to the fore. There's nothing wrong with having a plan in mind, as long as the plan takes us on a journey that feels grounded in something deeply meaningful. Michael Meade puts it very well that authenticity is what makes life truly meaningful and spiritually rewarding. So the journey itself needs to be meaningful. So therefore, the strategic thinking that we put into it, the planning we put into it, needs to have that foundation of meaning, of purpose. Otherwise, the journey itself becomes empty. And that's what we see with these individuals, and why it finds expression as incongruence.
What you say here, pulling back the curtain a bit, I'm in a moment of mourning, of grieving. This notion that when you speak of people that don't necessarily consider the journey, social influencers that go, it is about this end goal, the most money.
Or fame, or whatever it is, notoriety.
Right. And specifically money being interpreted as a value. I think that is something that I mourn a lot, that I actually don't necessarily understand, and I have a hard time finding empathy for. How can someone associate money as a personal value? And yet we live in a world where it is seen, where fame and money and notoriety are seen as values to embody. And I feel a disconnect from that. I feel like an alien coming down to a planet that goes, I'm confused. I thought we were here to be honorable and caring and compassionate and loving, and to grow in ways that are inclusive, to where the circle is open to the point of where the circle doesn't exist because the circle is open, right? Rather than these very nice versus kind modalities that you noted earlier, these very surface-based modalities.
It's interesting as you speak, if I may interject, that I hear the heart of what you're sharing, that, and I can just as well hear the individual out there going, easy for you to say, they might misunderstand what you're saying as privilege. And it may very well be seen as privilege by many, as, you being a white male.
Yeah, who lives inside the imperial core. Let's just be very, very simple about that. Like, we live inside the empire of the United States of America. And even though there is a lot of inequality and a lot of imbalance, there is a inherent systemic degree of privilege that both you and I have, right?
Right, right. And I think that's the danger of then when we discuss money in this manner as a form of our soul. If I guess what I think I want to convey is, when money becomes the be all end all rather than the journey, something very dear to our humanity gets lost. And I think that's the point that you're making. And I wanted to discern that rather than it be seen only as a judgment of those who are desperately seeking to support their families, support themselves, make enough for rent and utilities and gas money and food each month.
Day to day, all over the world.
Day to day. Right. All around the world, that the vast majority of people actually live that way. In pulling back the curtain, if people really understood the degree to which you and I each face those same quandaries as well, like the challenges that come with making the choices we make in order to get the message out around the subjects we cover, that the energy and the time that we put into this with no financial gain to either of us, but because we believe in the message that we're sending out.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And that
That the journey for us lies in this.
and
And
figuring
yeah,
this out, because I think the delicious irony of really wanting to explore what it means to be congruent also meant that we had to write a lot into it, and finding that balance of writing a script and really having a conversation, connecting heart to heart, mind to mind, soul to soul, and riding that wave, finding that rhythm in the moment takes practice. And so that's the thing. The podcast is practice to you and I, of how we express our values, of how we're authentic.
Right.
And to go back to those edges for a moment, sometimes it's a sharp edge, sometimes it's a bumpy road, sometimes it's shaky. And that's okay. That's okay.
Right. That this notion of being congruent takes a lot of practice. And I don't think either of us are making a claim of perfection in that realm, but we're
Certainly not. And I don't want that. I don't need that.
right. We're working it.
We're working it.
The notion of being better is the mantra of congruency. Like, how can I be a better Martin, a better Ben, a better myself in relation to these challenges that are coming to us all in this very dark time, where I would offer what we're sharing with everyone. We're not offering this as a solution or as a form of advice, right? At a certain level, what we're sharing is a practice to be experienced within ourselves that's contains quiet. It contains a way of being present, of being gentle, to being kind, compassionate, self-compassionate for ourselves and for those that we care for. That these are the anchors that hold us steady when life feels like too much, which in this dark time, it can often feel like it's too much. In this time of upheaval led by men, largely by men with poor leadership skills, I want to reassure anyone listening that I don't know how it will come to be, but it will be okay. More than okay. We will heal and grow and come through this on personal and collective paths that will serve life and love in all the ways that are needed.
Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.